Be in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We're going to start reading in verse 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11. O ye Corinthians, our mouth is open unto you. Our heart is enlarged. You are not straitened in us, but you are straitened in your own bowels. Now for a recompense in the same, I speak as unto my children, you also be enlarged. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness? Or what communion has light with darkness? And what concord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has he that believes with an infidel? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them, and I will walk in them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, says the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and I will be a father unto you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. All right, first, let's look at a few textual considerations. I think it's always important as we go through the text of the Scripture and teaching and in preaching it, that we look at the text itself and analyze how it's put together, how it's written, different things about it. So we're going to look at a few things of that, and then we'll look at some of the message that's being communicated. But first, let's just look at a few things about the text itself. First is, if you notice, we jumped the chapter and read the first verse. For some of you, that might have been like a tear in the time-space continuum, right? But believe it or not, the chapter divisions, I know you probably have never heard this before, but the chapter divisions aren't actually meaningful divisions, okay? They're not meaningful divisions of the text. So if you look at it, I think you'll see right away that the 7 verse 1 is obviously connected to the first, because he says, having therefore these promises. Which ones? Well, the ones he just said in the previous chapter, right? That's why we read past the chapter. Don't be afraid of doing that. You'll find that often, not always, but often, the chapter division is there to help you reference things. It's not there to actually help you understand things, okay? So have no fear of blowing right through the chapter division. Just blow right through it. It'll be all right. It won't hurt you. All right. Another thing is, I want you to notice how the text, the first portion, the first clause, which is verses 11 through 13, is unnecessarily, and some people are going to be very offended when I say this, so trigger warning, brace yourself for impact. Here it comes. It's unnecessarily archaic. Now, I feel that I can say this because I'm a staunch defender of all the false accusations that are leveled against the King James Bible, that it is often archaic. It is seldomly archaic, in my opinion. Seldomly archaic. And I think most of the archaic portions, most people who complain about them don't even know where they are, because those are the real archaic ones. The ones where you think you understand it, but because the words have changed meaning so dramatically since it was translated, that you don't even know you're not understanding it. Those are the archaic ones that generally are problematic. So the one that we often will use as an example here is where Paul says that if a widow has nephews, that she shouldn't be a burden to the church. Well, that word nephews doesn't mean what you might think it means. It doesn't mean your siblings' children. It means your grandchildren. It's an archaic word for grandchildren that has drastically changed in meaning over time, to where now when you read it, you think you're reading modern English, but you're not. So those are the archaic portions that are generally problematic, and there's very few of them, very few, right? But this is one of them. This is unnecessarily archaic. Now, it wasn't archaic when it was translated. I'm not criticizing the translators of the King James Bible or the translation. But in our day and age, for the average reader, that is a very difficult thing to read, and I cannot find much benefit to the archaic expression of it, right? Our mouth is open unto you. Our heart is enlarged. These are medical terms today that people understand that don't have a great deal of significance in the context. An enlarged heart is not a good thing today and age. We have a different idea of what that means to have an enlarged heart, right? You are straightened in your bowels. That that doesn't mean what it used to mean. It just doesn't. So there's nothing wrong with this translation. This isn't a criticism, but there are more modern ways to phrase that would be more meaningful to the average reader. So this is one of these few places that I actually identify in the classic King James translation that I think could use a little update and bring it into a language that is more accessible to the modern reader, which I think is what the Bible is meant to be. Believe me, when the KJV translators in 1611 translated the King James Bible, they weren't trying to make it archaic. They themselves said they were trying to put it in to their language of the day, which they did a marvelous and fantastic job at doing. And English has changed so little that most of, and I mean like 99% of the King James Bible really is very current, very relevant, very understandable, very approachable. Now, I say all that to point out this because I want you to understand this as it pertains to the textual issues of this text as well as the Bible as a whole. You need to learn to differentiate between what is archaic, like these phrases, and what is arcane. Now, there's a difference between being archaic and arcane. So arcane means that it's hard to understand. But it's not because the words have fallen out of favor. So when you look at it, it says, Paul says, if any widow has nephews, she shouldn't be a burden to the church. That's not arcane. That's easy to understand. All of you in this room understood that. Well, not really, unless you know what nephews are. Now that's archaic, but not arcane. See what I'm saying? This text is archaic because we no longer use the terms of having an enlarged heart or being straightened, or certainly not being straightened in our bowels. That's just not how we speak at all today. In fact, you probably have never read a book where they ever say things like that, right? Not even very sophisticated literature talks like that. That is all very archaic language, okay? But it's also arcane with it. And this is why. If you look at modern translations of those verses, you're going to find that they translate it in two different ways. Now, this isn't because there's any problem, textual problem or manuscript problem in those verses. It's because nobody is exactly sure what Paul meant. There is a word there, the Greek word is en, spelled in Greek letters, but it's en, that no one's exactly sure how it should be translated at this place. Because that word can be translated as in, by, at, on, upon, among. There's a lot of different ways that word can be translated. It's not exactly sure. It is the place where Paul says, he says, you are not straightened in, that's the word, in, and we actually get our word in from very convoluted way from the Greek word. Actually is interesting. But anyways, you are not straightened in us. We're not sure what he means by that exactly. There's two ways that this could be taken. And if you look at different translations, you'll see they kind of split. Half go one way, half go another. Let me just point a few out to you and we'll move along. But like half of them will say, and this is more modern English also, but they'll say, we are not withholding our affection from you, rather you're withholding your affection from us. So that's how they translate it. But you see what they're saying? We are not, nor we the apostles are not withholding our affection from you, because that's what straightened means, right? We are not closing ourselves off from you. you're closing yourselves off from us. That's one way of doing it. The other one is, you are not closed off because of us. Or you are not restricted by us. We are not causing it there. You're restricted of your own affections. You see how it's different? One of them is saying, we love you, you just don't love us. That would be a very paraphrased way. The other is saying, your lack of love isn't our fault, it's your fault. And what you read in the King James, which is arcane, not archaic, the part of it that is arcane, the King James translates it and leaves the ambiguity in. Now that's why I really like the King James Bible. Very few other translations do it. It's a fantastic thing that it does. Every time I try to look at other translations, I don't like them very much because they get rid of the ambiguity and they try to commentate too much, in my view. They give too much explanation and they make choices for the reader. I don't like that. I like that when there's ambiguity in the text, for it to be communicated. And that's what this does here. So you have two things going on in this that you should look at. One is the archaic language, which we could fix real easily, right? We could talk about, instead of bowels, affections. Instead of straightened, we could put restricted or withholding. Those would be all very good updates to the language, right? Our heart is open to you. Our mouth is wide open. What does that mean when it says that? We spoke freely to you. Our heart was wide open to you. Okay? That's all good. What I don't like about the modern translations is that they tend to over commentate, right? And they take away the arcane along with the archaic. And I resist that. Anyways, okay. We will move on, so you can all relax now. That was the point of impact. That's where everyone's like, there he goes again. Now you can relax. We're going to move on. All right. Well, not exactly. Okay. So he says, we're still on textual issues. Unequally yoked together. Love that phrase. Be ye not unequally yoked. That's all one word in the Greek New Testament. Unequally yoked together. I like it. The reason I like this is because we cannot find that Greek word anywhere else. Not just in the Bible. As far as we can tell, Paul made up that word. Well, you don't call it making it up when you're an author, right? You make up words. Paul coins words, exactly. He coined the word. That's what sophisticated people do. I don't make up words. You guys make up words. I coin words. No, I don't. I really don't. I make up words. Paul coined the word. You know it's coined, not made up, when other people start using it, right? Then you know it's a coined word. And as far as we can tell, Paul coined this word. And we actually have this exact word in English. So the Greek word is heterozygontes. Now, that's not the Greek pronunciation, okay? Don't worry about that. But the Greek word is, now we have that. If you do any study in genetics, we have a word, right? Heterozygotes. It explains why Nolan and Anna's baby is Weddle and they're not. That's why. Because they are heterozygotes. They are heterozygote. And now, in 1902, two English biologists took credit for coining that word. But that's the exact word Paul used 1,800 years earlier. The little plagiarists taking credit for stuff. Anyways, that's the word. And what does it mean? Well, you should know, right? Heterosexual, heterozygote. It means different, which is hetero, zygote, yoke. It's what it means in genetic. If you look up the etymology of the genetic word in English, that's what it means. Different yokes. Being put together in a different yoke. And so he makes that word. Now we translate that in the Bible as three words, right? Be not unequally yoked together. Or unequally yoked together would be the three words. Unequally yoked together. That's the word that's translated there. Okay, one other thing in the text that you need to understand is that word there, that name, Belial, right? It says that Christ and Belial. That is a transliteration from a Hebrew word. It's not found anywhere else in the New Testament, only here. And it is a personification. It had become by then a personification of Satan. But what it actually means is vile and worthless. So when he says there that you cannot be, what is it? He says, what concord has Christ with Belial? What it means is son of vile or son of worthlessness, right? That's what the Hebrew would mean there. So what he's calling Satan is son of worthlessness, which is very interesting. I think that's very interesting. So it just reinforces what we've discussed before, that we need to, no matter how frightening or concerning might be a better word, Satan is in your life, and we really need to do a study on that, because Christianity has way underplayed the role that Satan has in our lives and how we should approach this. However, no matter how concerning he might be to you and I, he's of no concern whatsoever to God. God doesn't look on him as a formidable enemy. He looks on him as a son of worthlessness. So I like that. That's pretty cool. Okay. And just to put that into a little bit of perspective, you can find that word being used as Eli's sons were called sons of Belial. Eli, your sons are sons of worthlessness. Nabal was a son of Belial, a son of worthlessness. You ever read the story of Nabal? Yeah. Even his own servants thought he was worthless. Everyone thought he was worthless. He wasn't even good enough to be worthless. He was just a son of worthlessness, right? Very interesting. Okay. Now let's talk about a little bit about how this text falls in the book, because we always ought to look at that as well. We ought to consider the context of what we're looking at. 2 Corinthians is a very unique book, very interesting. This is like the only exhortation in the whole book, direct exhortation. It's a big book. It's a pretty long book. It's one of the longer epistles, right? And you read like Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, like Nolan today taught on Ephesians 1. You read through these books, they're full of exhortations. He gives a doctrinal, usually Paul's epistles follow a certain paradigm. He'll give a doctrinal explanation, and it'll usually be the first quarter of the book, depending on the length of the book. And then he goes into how that doctrinal exhortation should work out in life, and he gives you a bunch of exhortations. For instance, the most classic ones are the Ephesians and Colossians, where he talks about how you should treat your husband, how you should treat your wife, how you should treat your kids, and he gives all these exhortations, all that are built on the doctrinal teaching of the first part of the book, right? But it'll be a lot of them. 2 Corinthians only has one actual direct exhortation. There's the part where he talks about the money he's gathering for the poor in Jerusalem, and he says, and you were mindful to do it, and get at it and do it, and don't embarrass me. But it's really not the type of exhortation you expect out of an epistle. That's kind of like him having a business meeting with them. The one direct exhortation in the book of 2 Corinthians is what we just read, right in the middle of the book. So if you could imagine 2 Corinthians visually, it looks like an axe. It looks like a wedge. And right at the apex of the wedge, you have this text right there. Whole epistle written to convey one exhortation. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. All right. So what is Paul doing? Well, from the first of the book until here, what's he talking about? Well, he's given his resume. You read through it and you'll see. Paul is given his resume and he's going through his bona fides so that he can, in a way, soften the blow, so he can gain some confidence, some access to them. This is completely different, or we could say opposite, the approach of 1 Corinthians. If you've read 1 Corinthians, think about the difference between these books. In 1 Corinthians, it's Paul the gunslinger, right? Pew, 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 shooting everybody down. Just burning Corinth to the ground. Just brutal. In 2 Corinthians, not at all. He's saying, let me explain who I am. Let me explain why you should listen to me. Let me make the case for myself. In fact, he even says that. And that's all a whole thing. I can't get into that, or I'll get lost in that for us, so we'll stay out of there. But that's what he's doing, right? He's establishing his bona fides. And he comes up, when he's got it all done, 6 chapters of doing this, he comes up and says, now that I've built all this currency with you, I want to spend it, and I'm going to put it all on red. I'm going to put it all here. This is the exhortation. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Now, when you read this book and you read commentaries about this book, most of them think that this is kind of like a parenthetical clause because it seems to come out of nowhere. I don't think that's the case. I think that if you'll read the book the way I've described it, I think it'll make sense that what he's done is establish himself to almost like say, let me reintroduce myself to you. Let's have a fresh start, right? We had 1 Corinthians. I burned the place to the ground. I stomped all over the ashes. Well, I won't get any more graphic than that. And then what happens now? He says, but you know what? Why don't we have a fresh start? And let me introduce myself. Let me explain who I am and what's going on. And then let me just give you one thing. Let me just give you one thing to take away with you. And here it is. Boom. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Now, it seems that this is like a free radical passage that comes out of nowhere. I don't think it does. I actually think it fits in perfectly, not only in the context of 2 Corinthians, but in the context of 1 Corinthians. And I think you really have to look at these 2 books really as one book in the sense that, because he refers to 1 Corinthians many times of what he wrote before and what's going on. This is just like, part 2, and that's why we call it 2 Corinthians. It's really pretty amazing, right? So you have 2 Corinthians, and it's the sequel. It's part 2 of 1 Corinthians. And it's all tied together. And if you look at 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, this exhortation lands right in the context. It's exactly there. Just go through a few things real quick, kind of point that out. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, he says, I wrote an epistle to you not to company with fornicators. Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. That's summary, right? He's just summarizing that. 1 Corinthians 5:11. If any man is called to be a brother and is found to be these things, don't have company with him. Again, 1 Corinthians 6:11, that we shouldn't go to law before unbelievers one with another. This is summarized in not being unequally yoked together with unbelievers. He says in 1 Corinthians 6:15 that we shouldn't take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot, saying we shouldn't have relations with prostitutes. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. In 1 Corinthians 10, dealing with the Lord's Supper, he says you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. This is the summary. It's almost as if Paul is saying, I feel we might have gotten off a little bit on the wrong foot. So let me reintroduce myself, and let me try to say this a little calmer, a little more academically, a little less fire, and a wee bit more light. Right? Be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Okay. There's also in 1 Corinthians, like even almost a positive view of this, right? Where he kind of, where you can look at this and see, and we're going to examine this a little closer later, how this can be tempered. And because you say, well, what does that mean? Don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Well, typically, how is that interpreted? Well, you can't marry someone who's not saved. Now, certainly that falls into that category. Certainly it does. And in Corinthians, it says that you can marry anyone you want as long as it's in the Lord, right? So obviously that's there. But 2 Corinthians does not deal with marriage at all. That's not the context of that epistle at all. Now, it is the context of 1 Corinthians. And there's no doubt that not being unequally yoked together with unbelievers is applicable to marriage. But it goes far beyond that. But there is a positive side to this where Paul says that he became weak for those that were weak. He became a Jew for the Jews. He became under the law for those who were under the law. Now, isn't that being unequally yoked together with unbelievers? He's becoming them. For them. Ah, interesting. We'll get back to that later. So, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Now, this comes from, and any of you who are familiar with the Scriptures will know right off the bat, right? You read that, you know. This is obviously a reference to the Old Testament. The Old Testament prohibited yoking together, and for those that don't know and don't know what a yoke is, let me explain. A yoke is, and if you looked at the sermon title on Facebook, you saw, and behind there, it said Unequal, and they had a yoke hanging on the wall. It's like a big stick, right, that you'd put over the neck of two animals so that they will pull together. So you hook them up to a plow, and you put two of them together, you hook them up to the plow, and together they pull, and so you get the strength of both animals together. Well, the law of Moses prohibited hooking up two different animals together. In fact, he actually says you can't hook up an ox with a donkey. There's another archaic word that would be good to modernize. So not donkey, the one that is there. So you have a donkey and an ox. The law of Moses says you can't yoke them up together. The law of Moses also says you can't have shirts that are made from two types, or any clothing made from different types of clothing, different types of thread. So you can't have polyester and cotton shirts, which basically means all of your underwear are forbidden because they all have elastic in them. That's all wrong. You got to get rid of the elastic and walk around with it holding everything up. That's what it means. So I always know when someone who keeps the law isn't actually keeping the law because they don't seem to have much trouble with their underwear falling down. Okay. Kelly loves it when I talk like that. Loves it. It's just for you. I write that and I put Kelly next to it. Okay. So this is all coming. This is Paul. He is using the law, right, to get this. This is where he's getting this from. Be not unequally yoked together. And this is a passage that is almost always applied to marriage. Sadly, that's not wrong, but sadly, almost exclusively applied to marriage, and that is mistaken, because this goes far beyond that. Far beyond that. This is not just about marriage. What about going into a partnership, a business partnership with an unbeliever? Wouldn't that fall under that? There's some aspects of that relationship that are every bit as intimate as a marriage relationship. And I know some Christians who actually use this verse to say that you can't be in a business partnership with an unbeliever. I'm not advocating that, just to be clear. I just want to point that out. But I would ask, well then, what's the difference between that and buying shares in a company? Because you're part owner, right? I mean, so you can't own stock? So we look at this and we say, well, there's some difficulties here, and that's because I think we need to be careful in all the Scriptures not to apply oversimplistically, right? And Paul is not being oversimplistic here. But we all should acknowledge that this is a very important command and a very wise command, that as Christians, there should be some distance between us and the world. There should be some boundaries between us and the world. And that's what Paul is saying here. Okay, so how does he frame the issue? Let's look at the text then and see, what does Paul mean? When he says, and he makes up a word for it, which should immediately make us think, I don't know about that, Paul. I mean, where'd you get this from? You made up your own word for it and everything? We got a whole doctrine with your own made-up word? I jest. See, she liked it. So what does Paul mean by this? Surely you would, well, he goes to great lengths to spell out what this new word he made up means. He defines it like a dictionary. It's great. It really is great. Look what he says. I'll read it again. So he says, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And now he's going to explain what he means by this, how you can conceptualize this, how you can contextualize this. He says, five things. First, for what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness? Now, I want you to really pay attention. Really pay attention. The words that you're reading here in English are really masterful translations, for whatever that's worth, in my opinion. But you're going to see that he uses a different word for all five things, which is very, very, if you know anything about literature and anything about writing, this is great writing. Fantastic writing. Really is. You don't want to use the same word over and over, right? So he finds different words to go through and explain it. And that's really, really top shelf writing, okay? And it's that way in the Greek. They actually translated it out. It actually uses 5 different words, and they chose very carefully 5 words to do that. Even though they're awful synonymous, but they're different. Okay, first thing. What fellowship, that's the word, pay attention, what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness? Fellowship. 2, what communion, see how they're very similar, but they're different. What communion, light with darkness? 2, communion. 3, what concord? What concord has Christ with Belial? So fellowship, community, concord. 4, what part has he that believes with an infidel? Fellowship, communion, concord, part. And 5, and what agreement has the temple of God with idols? Now isn't that's, like I say, that's fantastic writing. So that's how he's defining what he's talking about. This is how he's contextualizing this. This is how you can think about it. So what he's giving you is 5 different types of intimate relationships where you can see where this should be applicable and how it's applicable. So let's look at those, each one individually. First he says, what fellowship does righteousness have with unrighteousness? The word for unrighteousness he uses is anomia, which means no law, what we would call lawlessness. Right? It's not just that you're evil, it's that you reject all law. You're without law, without righteousness. Okay, so what fellowship? We talked about this last week. And this is a word that is typically not understood by Christians, the average Christians, right? If you do some real research, you know. But if you haven't researched the word, well, then we think of fellowship as what we do after the open meeting. We eat donuts, we talk, we have a good time. Maybe after the meeting, we're going to go out to a restaurant and we're going to fellowship, and we call that fellowship. And there is an element of fellowship in it, but that itself is not what fellowship is. Think of fellowship as what a professor gets at a college. He wins a fellowship, right? He becomes part, or think of it this way. Think of a pledge in a fraternity. It's where you have an association based on shared values and objectives. That's what a fellowship is. It's an association that's not based on race. It's not based on economic status. It's not based on geography. It's based on shared values and shared objectives. We want to achieve the same thing using the same value system to do so. That's a fellowship. It's like a fraternity without all the drinking and all the pranks. Right? It's a fraternity. So we could say it's a pledge. So what fellowship does righteousness have with unrighteousness? Well, none, obviously, by definition. If a fellowship is about shared values and shared objectives, well, righteousness and unrighteousness have no shared values and no shared objectives. So how can you yoke together righteousness with unrighteousness? Well, you can't. You can't. It doesn't work. Okay, communion. This would mean intimacy. That's what communion means. Intimacy means sharing. Community, communism, all that comes from the same word, which is common, having things in common. Now, I'm not saying that community is communist, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying we have these English words that we do understand. That's what they mean. It means sharing things in common. When the Bible speaks of our communion, That's what it's talking about. That we have sharing, that we have an intimate relationship in which everything is shared. That's what intimacy is. Intimacy is the complete opening up of yourself to someone else and them to you. Completely sharing everything between each other, whether it's marital intimacy, whether it's brotherly intimacy. There's all types of intimacies, and it's not really a matter of sexuality is only a component or only a feature of some types of intimacy. It's not intimacy itself. You can be intimate, you can have sexual relations with a prostitute. That's not intimacy. That is actually the opposite of intimacy. It's the opposite of it. It is wanting sex without intimacy. So sex is not intimacy, although it is part of marital intimacy, right? It's part of it. It's an element of marital intimacy, but it's not in and of itself that. So communion is that intimate relationship, that completely open relationship. And he says, what kind of intimacy can light have with darkness? None. Zero. Light has no intimacy with darkness whatsoever. Concord. What concord, he says, does Christ have with the son of worthlessness, with Satan? What does that mean? Well, that means harmony. In fact, the Greek word there is symphonesis, symphony. What symphony, what harmony can Christ strike with Satan? Satan and God are not the yin and the yang. They're not. You've seen the yin and the yang symbol, right? It's got the black and the white, and it's how good and bad, good and evil, and all things, pain and pleasure, all come together, and they're really one. No, they're not. Christ has no harmony, no concord with Satan. And then he says, what part, we all know that one, that's an easy one, right? What part, what portion, what share does a believer have with an infidel? Revelations 21 makes this super clear. He says, he that overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. That's the ones who overcome. That's the believer. But the fearful and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and liars shall have their part, because we have our part. It says the believers have their part with God. You're his son, he's your father. But the unbeliever has his part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. What part does a believer have with an unbeliever? Zero part. There's no sharing there. There's nothing to share. And then the fifth one he does is, what agreement does God have with the idols? Think of agreement less or more formally than we normally use it. In fact, the word there means to put down a joint deposit together. So think of it in that way. Think of it in this way. What alliance is there between God and idols? None. No alliance. None. No agreement. There's no partnership between God and idols. They're not working for the same things. They're not pursuing the same hopes or dreams or any of that. So, 5 things he says. When he says, be not unequally yoked together, he's talking about fraternity, intimacy, harmony, sharing, and alliances. You need to keep those away from unbelievers. This does not mean that you can't have unbelieving friends. That's not what that means. This doesn't mean that you can't work for an unbeliever or hire one or even go into business with one. But you want to be very cautious that you're not giving away to unbelievers fraternity, intimacy, harmony, sharing, and alliance. Okay, having said all that, the little bit of time we have left, I want to talk to you a bit about then what you might be thinking about all this, at least what I was thinking as I come through and I look at all this. And that is that it seems that if we follow this, it seems as if we're going to make enemies of the world. And a lot of people have a real hard time with that. They don't want to be at enmity with the world. They don't want to be seen by the world as being holier than thou and being aloof, isolated. They want to be friends with people. They want to live in their community. I get it. So let's talk a little bit about that. Do you know what the world hates more than a dogmatic, holier than thou, the wrong word, but as they see it, sanctimonious Christian? You know what they hate more than that? There's only one thing they hate more than that. And everyone hates it more. A hypocritical one. The number one thing that people complain about Christianity and about the church isn't that they're holy, it's that they're hypocrites. And so consider it for a moment what you're saying. Or what we're all saying. I don't mean you. I'm not trying to point anyone out. This is what Christianity is saying. We're so concerned that they will see us as being too holy and unapproachable that our solution is to, well, there's only one option left. And that's to be hypocritical. You say, why? You're not holy because you want to be. And you're not holy because you feel holy. And you're not holy because you act holy. You're holy because God has sanctified you. It's not your work. Holiness is not a description of how you behave. It is a characterization of your spiritual nature that is given to you through the new birth. So, if you're repressing who you are to curry favor with the world, to try to be friends, and I'm not downplaying that, I'm not diminishing that. I think we do need to find how we can be friends with those people around us. We shouldn't be unapproachable. We should do everything. What did Paul say? I said we get back to this. He says, I become weak to the weak. I become a Jew to the Jews. I become under the law to those who are under the law. I become all things to all men. I want everyone to be able to approach me, and I want to be able to have an impact on everyone's life, and I don't want to be dismissed out of hand. But I can't achieve that through hypocrisy. The world will hate you more for not being who they know you are than for being who they know you are. Happens every day. In fact, they so much hate hypocrisy that they will fabricate it in the life of any Christian they can through rumor and innuendo, because they know that if they can convince people that you're a hypocrite, everyone will hate you, even if it isn't true. So, it may seem that open-mindedness and being open to the world, that's like the ultimate virtue. But it's not. So let's talk a little bit about that, because that's important. Today, in our day and age, the ultimate virtue in the world is open-mindedness, tolerance. The only way you can have open-mindedness is if you have clearly defined boundaries. It may seem oxymoronic, and it sounds that way, I know. But openness without boundaries isn't openness. Outer space, then, is open. But you'll die if you go there. Nothing, no life can live in outer space because it has no boundaries. Oxygen can't be contained, atmospheric, everything just... The only way a person is open is if they first have established boundaries, which are your value system. Excuse me. And I know that if you hold these values, you're going to be termed to be closed. But think about the text as we started reading it, what Paul says. Paul says, and I'll read it to you in a more updated English. He says, O Corinthians, we have spoken openly to you. Our heart is wide open. You are not restricted in us. You are restricted in your own affections. You're not closed in us. We're open. This is what I would tell the world. If you're here today and you're not saved, we're not closed. We speak openly to you. Our heart is wide open to you. You're closed in yourself. You're closed in your affections. Return the favor, he says. Be open to us. What does it mean to be open then? If it doesn't mean to lay down all values, just demolish all boundaries, flatten out everything, then what does it mean? Think of openness, instead of thinking of it as a wide open space like outer space, or a plane in which there's no boundaries and it just goes on endlessly. That's not openness. Think of openness as a really tall, impenetrable castle with a moat around it and alligators in it. Completely impenetrable with a drawbridge that can be let down and people can come in and out. Through a defined path, through a gate, through rules, parameters, but you can come in and out. That's openness. You don't have to lay aside all your values to be open. Paul was open. Read 1 Corinthians. Brutal. And yet he says, I'm not the one who's closed. I'm wide open to you. You're the one who's closed. I don't want to be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, but I'm wide open. We should be open to new ideas, but they need to be strong enough to overcome the bad ideas. Otherwise, how can we know they're good ideas? If I have no values, if I have no boundaries, if I have no walls around, if there's no impediments, then how can I know that any other ideas are even new ideas, much less good ideas? They have to overcome some challenge. So I put up a challenge. My value system is a challenge. Now I'm open. If you think I'm wrong, I want to hear it. Ask me at any time. Ask me for explanation. But your ideas must be logically coherent. They must be demonstrably useful. They must be empirically superior to my ideas. And I'm going to maintain my ideas until you can show me that your ideas are logically coherent, demonstrably useful, and empirically superior. Ideas should be like bricks in that castle. We pile them up. Your ideas should make my walls taller, not lower. If I see that you have a good idea, I see you have a good principle, I should take that and add it to mine, make it taller, or replace one of my faulty bricks with your brick and make my wall stronger, if not taller. But the openness that is being suggested by the world is no walls, no boundaries, no values. In our modern society, openness can be more considered, instead of a castle with bricks, they're like teardrops in an ocean. They displace nothing. They add nothing. They change nothing. They improve nothing. You have all this openness and all these ideas floating around like dust in the cosmos. They have no impact. That's not the openness that Paul's talking about. And that kind of openness, the person who's weeping their tears into the ocean is drained, but nobody's filled. Nobody's helped. Nobody even knows the difference. So that's the consequence that Paul observes. The restriction that the Corinthians felt, he says, you're straitened in your own bowels. You're restricted in your own affections. The restriction that they felt was closed-mindedness. Their own closed-mindedness. Telling you this, not because I think I can convince the world, because I can't. I know that. But I perhaps can convince you. It may seem awfully harsh for him to command for you not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And you think if I follow that, I'm going to be accused of being closed-minded, intolerant, bigoted. You probably will. The worst thing you could do is then be hypocritical about it and pretend you're not whatever it is they think you are. That's a no-win right there. But there's a better approach to it, and that is you need to be firmly persuaded, and you need to persuade. You can't persuade everybody, but you can persuade the people you care about, perhaps. I speak openly to you. My heart is wide open to you. I'm not closed. The closure you feel, the restriction you feel in this relationship, it's yours. You're closed because I'm wide open. Christians need to welcome the world into our hearts. I know this sounds opposite of what he's saying, but it isn't. We need to keep them out of our values. We can't be intimate with them, but we need to be wide open in our hearts to the world. Christians are not supposed to cloister themselves off in some monastery, fearful of being contaminated by those who don't share our values. I know it seems like the world is just going terrible and we all just need to run and hide. That is not what we need to do. We need to be more active, more involved in our communities, in our society, with our friends than ever before. And you should not think that the gospel does not have power today. It does have power. It is the power of God. But that power can only shine out when you open your heart to them while maintaining the boundaries of your values. You can't do just one. You can't be the principled Christian with the drawbridge pulled up, throwing alligators at people. You can't be that. You also can't be the Christian who knocks over his own walls from the inside and flattens them all out so everyone will think he's this wonderful, loving person. You cannot be one or the other. You have to have your boundaries, have your values, have not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, but have your heart wide open and no restrictions. You have to do both. Sure, it's a balancing act. That's why it's only for kings and priests like you. Right. Let's close with prayer. Father God in heaven, we need great wisdom. You have designed us for this. You have built us for this. It is in us to do this because you've put it there, because you've made us this way. So, Father, I ask that we would tap into that light, that knowledge, that understanding that you have put in us. No, we don't need anyone to teach us these things in our hearts. They're there. Father, just make us cognizant of them. Bring us into contact with this Holy Spirit that is in us so that we can be open and unrestricted and at the same time be strong in the righteousness and in the values that you've given us. I ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Have a great week. We'll be here next week at 3 o'clock.